you doing today, Plunky?
I am great. I want to welcome everybody to HR Records here in Washington, D.C. for Record Day and Black Fire Records Day. And thank you for coming. I'm Plunky,
Right.
and thank y'all for being here. We couldn't ask for a better day and a better crowd. Thank you so much.
And I should mention, you've got some hot sunglasses.
Ah, yes. Um, since I've got these glasses, I've gotten so many comments about them, I can't take them off. So you just have to bear with me.
Well, thank you, HR Records, Capital Bop, Blackfire, for allowing us to do this. But without further ado, let's jump right in. Okay, so we've got 3 segments today. The first part is going to be about your history, your ancient history. So I'm sure you'll agree that to fully understand Blackfire, you got to go back to the roots. And one of those roots is Juju. So can you tell us about 1969? What happened with you?
In 1969, I was performing in San Francisco in the Bay Area and was connected with a Zulu from South Africa whose name was Ndiko Aba. And Ndiko was in exile. He was here promoting the interests of South Africa to let the world know that there was a war going on in South Africa. And I performed with him for a couple of years, and when I left his group, we started a group called Juju. Juju was formed as the pit band for a theatrical event. The theatrical event was The Resurrection of the Dead by Marvin X. And in that play was a ritual drama that was based on music, these African rhythms, and it was actually a ritual that would go on every night, and some member of the cast would be renamed. The theory of the play was that black people in this country had been isolated from their roots and didn't know themselves. And so this play was a play based on African rhythms. We'd have these wild, energetic bimbes, these ceremonies in which some member of the cast would actually get a new name. And out of that process, when the play ended, the band members decided to stay together. We called ourselves Juju, partially because of Archie Shepp's The Magic of Juju, partially because Juju was a Nigerian West African religion kind of akin to voodoo, and we wanted to keep the spirit that we had gotten from Ndiko as he taught us African music and the principles of which, and let me say, the principles that we learned from Ndiko and have been a part of me for the last 45 or 50 years is the concept that African music is evaluated. Its aesthetic is based on not what you play, but how you play it. The amount of energy that you use, the amount of influence it has on the community, on the society, on your family, on the people listening. And so that became a guiding principle of Juju. Now, Juju was, I won't say unique, but very different, because I often describe Juju as a group that was based on these West African, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Brazilian rhythms with a wild screaming saxophone on top. I was an avant-gardist, and while playing with Ndiko, I saw, I felt, I heard the relationship between African music, traditional African music, and jazz music, traditional African music and blues, traditional African music and rhythm and blues. And that struck me. People like Pharoah Sanders, and I'm sure we'll get into some of this later, but
Oh, yeah.
people like Pharoah Sanders, when he had the record Timbi or Karma or Taoud, or those records were now what we refer to as spiritual jazz, but they were also African at heart. And
Sure.
We wanted to be a part of that movement in music. That music and that movement came out of the black arts movement of the 60s and 70s. We were, as a people, consciously trying to show and have this relationship with Africa as the mother continent, as the homeland. This was important to us during those times. The Vietnam War was all the rage, and the Vietnam War was at the center of left-wing politics. But we wanted to say that there was a war going on in the southern part of Africa, in Angola and in Mozambique and in South Africa.
Right, and that led you to recording something.
Yes.
What was that?
Well, we recorded couple of things. I see you have in your hand Indico's record, Indico and the
I was
Natives.
going to give you some visuals. Here you
Thank
go.
you for that. We recorded this within the only recording that the original group did. We recorded this literally in a garage in Los Angeles. The record was important to us because in those days you had to have a record to be perceived as having clout in the marketplace. And so we recorded this record, all of it recorded in one take, just like it was a live performance. There's a squeak at the beginning of my solo in No Musa that I wish I could remove, but in those days we didn't believe in mistakes. We believed that everything was it was maybe a divine error, but it was divine, and so everything was important. After this record with Juju, this is another visual aid. This is Cousin Wash. Kevin has everything. Cousin Wash was a record that wasn't widely distributed. It's a poetry album with an older gentleman doing these folksy, rootsy kinds of stories with our Indico's group as his backing music ensemble. And it was from that experience that we set about to record the Juju album. This is another album.
One more.
Yeah, this is another album from Kevin. Where you get all these things? This
Magic.
is Roach Ohm, Universal Expressions. This was a poetess from the San Francisco Bay Area with our group Juju backing her up. And that's all I'm gonna say about this album. It's pretty good music, and I like what she had to say. But this record is Juju's first record. It's called Juju, A Message from Mozambique. This record, quite frankly, is the beginning of my music career. This is me as a solo artist or with my bands. And this was Juju's recording, also recorded largely in one take. This is, when I say one take, we might have done multiple takes, but there was no overdubbing. There was no
on a 4-track, right?
Yeah, on a 4-track, reel to reel. And it became, in its own way, a kind of an iconic record. When we recorded this record, I learned about a company called Strata East.
All right, and I was going to ask you about your move to New York, so let's bridge into that.
That's exactly
perfect.
what happened. We recorded this record, and I heard about Strata East. And for those of you, I know most of you have heard of Strata East, but you may not know that Strata East was a record company that was really a collaboration, a collaborative, a cooperative is the right word. These were musicians who were also producers, and they band together to form a record label. And a quick thumbnail background on the way the record industry worked from 1920 when it started up until and through the Strata East era of 1970, 71. The record industry was based on the idea that an artist performed a record, recorded a record, the record company would market that record and give the artist a royalty. The royalty is a percentage that from the sales the artist would get. Generally, that percentage was as low as 5%. I should say, in some instances, as low as no percent. Originally, the artist would be paid, a standard fee was $200 per side, $200 for a side of a record, and that was all the artist got. Now, this concept was sold to the artist by saying, one, we are the record company, we own the recording equipment, we own the distribution, we have the ability to market it, and you have nothing but the music. You get to perform this music, we will market it, make that music famous, sell that music, but what it'll allow you to do is be famous enough to have a career performing. But you're not expected to make anything from these records. That's not your job. Your job is to play the music and play it live. Strata East wanted to turn that system on its head. Rather than give the artist 5% or 10% or 12%, which was a large percentage in those days, Strata East wanted to instead say, we, the artists, will own the record company, and we will make 85% of the return. And 15% of the return will go to our collective company, out of which we will keep the company going. That was the theory. And when we, the members of Juju, heard this in San Francisco, I said, we have to be a part of that, because that's going to turn the music industry on its head. It's going to put us in charge. It's going to give us self-determination. We're going to be in control of our own creativity. We picked up from San Francisco and moved to New York.
Which led to this, putting out.
We had already recorded this. We brought our tapes to New York, met with the people from Strata East. They said, okay, we love what you guys are doing, and we want you a part of our collective. And so we released this record, A Message from Mozambique. It came out in 1973. It was maybe the 5th or 6th record on the Strata East label. We released the record, and we made a temporary home in New York, and we performed around town, and we created a stir because, remember what I told you, Juju could be described as this African percussion group with avant-garde jazz on top. And let me mischaracterize free jazz of that period. Oftentimes, people would think of free jazz as either being timeless or atonal, without a chord center. But it was like African music because much of the free jazz movement was based on energy, based on screaming horns, based on investing yourself to you reach higher heights and trying to bring the audience along.
Right.
Juju was not quite a jazz group, but the jazz musicians of New York really took to us. I'm gonna let you hold that. Because we had rhythm and we had energy and we had improvisation.
And you started hanging with some giants there.
Well, I did. Before I left San Francisco, I became enamored with Pharoah Sanders, Archie Shepp, and people of that ilk. And with Pharoah spent time in the Bay Area, and whenever he played, Plunky was there, usually in the front row right at his feet. If he played 5 nights, 3 sets a night, I was there 5 nights, all 3 sets. And one thing happened at one of his stints at a club called the Both And Club. He had a fabulous band. He had, among other people, he had Stanley Clarke and Cecil McBee on bass. I could stop there. With those 2 bass players, how could you go wrong? He had Lonnie Liston Smith. He had Jimmy Hopps. Just a fantastic group. Gives me goosebumps thinking about what they were doing that week. Well, that week they played there, and he went from there to Detroit a week or so later. And I had a gig in Detroit with Indico. And so after my gig, I showed up at his gig in Detroit. Pharoah said, wow, didn't I just see you in San Francisco? Then they had a gig in New York, and I went from there to New York on other business, and so I'm there. He said, are you following me around? In today's vernacular, he would have said, you're stalking me, you know? Yeah. But eventually, I wore him down, and he had me join him to record this album. This is Wisdom Through Music, also with some fantastic players. I was in the studio with them. It was a great gig for me. It was life-changing because I got to play with my idol, Pharoah Sanders. It was great music. It was also great because it was a great payday.
Well, I'm sure
it was a great payday. I mean, I think I might have made $450 per day or something, and that was more than the band was making for a week. You know, it was like, wow, this is my check. So Pharoah did me a real solid to put me on in that way.
So when did you move to Richmond?
In 1973, when Message from Mozambique came out, let me tell you something you may not know. As a avant-garde musician in the early 70s in New York City, life was hard. There was not a lot of money being made, though I was hanging out with people like Sam Rivers, who had a studio in his basement. I met Ornette Coleman. Ornette came to see us. Let me just say this. When I came to, I have to square this with you. I didn't just pick up and come from San Francisco to New York nilly-willy. Really what happened was I got a gig with something called the New York Musicians Festival, and that sort of paid for us to come there, and then we stayed there. But in the New York Musicians Festival, we played at Alice Tully Hall in Lincoln Center, and we burnt the stage down. I'm telling you, we got a great review in the New York Times, and Ornette met us, and within a week of meeting Ornette, he said, Plunky, I'm going to North Africa for several weeks. Can you keep my place and watch my gallery? I just met the man. Ornette was like that. Now, some might say, well, he was crazy. But I think he just sensed how sincere we were.
Right.
you almost can't do that kind of music without some real sincerity. That's not the kind of thing you try to fake, especially for no money. If you're doing this, what I was doing at that time, we were living on 2 meals a day, and the first meal was a slice of pizza, which we call the slice of life. You ready to get your slice of life? And slice for life, that's what kept us alive. And then we'd eat at this little Indian restaurant every day. They sort of took us in. For $2, we'd get a plate of food. So I think Ornette, not crazy, I think Ornette saw our sincerity, and he also appreciated our music. So that was monumental. I don't know if you were asking me about that, but Ornette was instrumental in my development because I saw him use the first floor of his loft space as an art gallery, and he lived above. You asked me about getting to Richmond, and now I'm telling you. So we left New York after that first record, after about a year, and we moved back to Richmond, where we recorded our second album, Juju Chapter 2 Nia. We recorded that in Richmond. That's this album. That brought us to Richmond. And now let me tell you something else you might not know. In 1974, there was not a lot of avant-garde African music in Richmond, and not a lot of fans for it either. So Richmond had an influence on our music. We came there to influence the community. I started an art gallery in my friend's home. It was the first black art gallery in the state of Virginia. We had some tremendous art being exhibited. Our first major exhibit was by an artist named Murray DePillars. Murray DePillars was part of the Chicago art scene called Afrocoba. He went on to become the dean of the School of the Arts at VCU, but his first exhibit in Virginia was at our house gallery. And we played our avant-garde jazz music, but Richmond influenced us. We added elements to change the music ever so slightly and ever so greatly. We added a vocalist whose name was Jackie Lady Ekayete Lewis. That changed our sound completely. She had this mellow, almost Roberta Flack type voice, and that mellowed our wild screaming music. We also added a trap drummer. Before that, we had just had Latin percussion, or African percussion, no drums. We added a funky drummer, and eventually we added a guitarist. These things gave us a more R&B, soulful element to the music. And we changed the name from Juju to Oneness of Juju. Lon Marshall, our vibist, came up with that name, and he said, it's not like we're selling out. We're letting people know that all these music are part of the same thing. This avant-garde, this jazz music, this African music is really of the same people as the blues and rhythm and blues and funk and soul music. We're the same. And so we're now professing that we're demonstrating the oneness of Juju, Juju being this magical African essence to us.
Right. And so meanwhile, bridging into Blackfire, in D.C., what's going on?
In D.C., we're not telling this story chronologically, but kind of we are. In 1973, 74, when I joined Strata East, soon thereafter, look up Strata East if you don't know. Strata East is a iconic jazz label. It had people like Clifford Jordan. Pharoah Sanders did a record or two on Strata East. The Piano Choir, Charles Tolliver, any number of world-renowned jazz musicians. But it also to me, the roster was divided into two parts. The older, more established stage jazz musicians and the young lions. And the young lions were Plunky, Oneness of Juju at the time, because we were young, Mtume, and Gil Scott-Heron. We were the young guys. We were breaking the mold of straight jazz music. Gil in a very different way from me and Mtume. Mtume's record starts with maybe a 10 or 12 minute diatribe on Afrocentricity, more or less. Juju's records were African oriented. Gil's record was more R&B-ish and jazz with him and Brian Jackson. Gil's record was a problem. This record was a problem. It was a problem because there was a song on this record called The Bottle, and The Bottle became a hit record. And we had to collectively, Strata East and all of the black music community of New York had a question, a rhetorical question to answer. And that was, did we want to preserve the culture and preserve what was considered jazz music? Or did we want to have a viable company? Did we even want to have a hit record? Did we want to influence broad community, or did we want to target it more focused community? Did we want to deal with the distributors and the people who influenced the popular world? Did we want to chart? Did we want to deal with WBLS records as opposed to WKCR at Columbia, which was playing jazz and avant-garde? We had to answer those questions, and those questions were not easy to answer. But what happened was Gil's record, The Bottle, became such a massive hit that people all over the world wanted that record, and they couldn't get it because Strata East was controlling that record. And we had to decide, our little 15% that we were putting in and supposed to keep the records in print, did we want to take all the money and print up only Gil's record or not? And for the most part, they chose not. I won't judge that decision. That was a business decision. But there was a man in DC who was Strata East's promotion and distribution person for this region. And that man's name was Jimmy Gray. I met Jimmy Gray because I thought I was going to have to sue him because I get a magazine with a picture of the Message from Mozambique on the cover, and the logo for the magazine was that picture. And I'm going, Strata East, who is this that's using my picture and didn't tell me and why? And they said, wait, calm down. That's the magazine. Kevin has everything. This is the picture of the first Black Fire magazine. And I saw this and said, wait, Black Fire, and that's me there? How come I don't get something for that? They said, well, calm down. You should know Jimmy Gray because you're down in Richmond now, and Jimmy Gray is the distribution person and promotion person for that region. You should get to know him, and I did. And Jimmy and I became fast friends. One of the things that happened to us was the Gil Scott-Heron record. Because Gil was living in Washington at that time, he had about 2,000, 3,000 copies of his own, which he didn't deal with through Strata East. While we were having this big debate that I'm telling you about whether or not we wanted to even have hit records, Gil had pressed the records for himself, and he chose Jimmy to distribute that record. He wasn't going to go through Strata East's offices because Strata East, there was a kind of a bottleneck about what they were going to do with the record. So Jimmy, for a minute, Jimmy Gray was the only person on earth that had copies of the Gil Scott-Heron record. Now, what this did for Jimmy Gray and subsequently Plunky was that meant that while Jimmy had been the promotion person for several jazz labels, CTI, some Blue Note distribution, Prestige. People came to him if they wanted their records promoted, their jazz records promoted.
It's a distribution
list. Why does he have everything? So that meant he had a cadre of people he was dealing with. But it greatly expanded when people literally all over the country were calling around to say, where can we get this record? Where can we get The Bottle? There's only one place. Jimmy Gray, who has a company called Black Fire. His promotion concern was called Black Fire, which meant in about a 6-month period, he went from having maybe 10 distribution places to having hundreds. People all over the country suddenly knew the name Black Fire because that was the one place you could get the Gil Scott-Heron record that was so hot. I'm going to say the epilogue to that story is that eventually we meaning us, Jimmy and Gil Scott, we lost control of that record. Because one of the things that happened was that when people couldn't get it for several months and the record stayed hot for that long, people just made cover versions of it. Different people, different labels just put out bootleg versions or legitimate versions were just covers of that song, and they ended up selling more copies than we sold because they had distribution. They could get it in all those stores like this used to be, you guys are too young, but stores like this used to be in every neighborhood, or at least every city. You'd go to the record store to buy records. If you couldn't get the record at the record store, you couldn't get it. There was no streaming. There was no alternative ways to get a record. You had to get it at a record store. So those guys could put it in record stores. And we didn't have enough copies to do all that. So we lost control of the record. But Jimmy and I decided that we would start a record label.
Let me stop you there. That's a good spot for break number 1.
Okay. Thank you. I knew that. Thank you. Good thought.
All right. So let's go back into it.
Okay.
All right. So we've mentioned Jimmy Gray now.
Yes.
Let's go a little into Jimmy Gray. So explain Jimmy Gray's background coming into the time that you met him.
Jimmy Gray was a magical jack of all trades. He was primarily a black music lover, jazz lover, but a black music lover, including R&B. And he was a record collector. Those were perhaps not his most important characteristics, but those were central characteristics to who he was. He was a record promotion person. He was also a radio DJ. He was a promoter of live events. And he was a liaison to many of the jazz musicians from Sun Ra through anybody who was anybody in jazz who would come through D.C. would look him up. His house was a hospice, a place where people would come and gather, rest, talk music. And he decided that he, in addition to all those things, he was also going to be a record producer. He had his hands on music at the radio stations. He had his hands on mixing boards at the radio stations. And he decided that what happened to Gil had put him on the map, one, and what happened to Gil shouldn't happen. Because Jimmy, while Charles Tolliver and Stanley Cowell, who were the president and vice president of Strata East, were primarily musicians, Jimmy was primarily a businessman. He was a music business person, and so he saw the value of these records and what they meant culturally. His idea to call his company Black Fire was a political act, which made it very comfortable for me because, remember, I'm coming from this place that I have this African philosophy that we're judging things based on its impact in the marketplace, its impact in the community, its impact on the village. And Jimmy saw that immediately. He chose Black Fire. I would be putting words in his mouth. I know that Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, had a book called Black Music and Black Fire. I'm not sure where he got the name, but I am sure that he was thinking that this music could set a fire under the community. Mm-hmm. That this would be politics, the politics of blackness raging. And he saw that. He also saw the impact of two particular labels, Blue Note and CTI, the impact that those record album covers had as art. It's one thing to hear the music, but he was also very visually oriented.
Right, I was going to ask you about that. So
the importance of the visuals.
We're about to jump into that. Okay. Let's start with the first release on Blackfire Records.
So Jimmy and I said, Jimmy, I'm getting ready to release another record, and I don't want to do it on Strata East. It's not straight ahead jazz. I'm living in Richmond now. I have these R&B influences. It's not going to work at Strata East. I saw what happened with Gil. It's not going to work. Mm-hmm. I'm going to release this myself. He said, well, I'm forming a record company. So we released a song called African Rhythms. Remember, I told you I met Jimmy because he had my picture on the cover of that magazine, visual. He thought that Juju's painted African faces depicted Black Fire, this idea of African-centered energy, political force. We released African Rhythms. African Rhythms has a very simple message, and it says, African rhythms make you clap your hands. African rhythms make you want to dance. Let the rhythms take you to the truth, Mother Africa. That's the whole lyrics. It's a simple message, but it was a message that was identifiable. It was simple enough for people to grasp and get on one or two listenings. And we had a kind of a secret weapon, and that was Mr. Jimmy Watkins, who was the station manager, or the general manager of WHUR. And Jim Watkins' claim to fame was that he grew up 3 doors away from me. And when I released the record, he said, oh, I can do something with this record. And he put this record, African Rhythms, as the theme song for the Daily Drum on WHUR, which meant that it was getting daily airplay in a market like Washington, D.C., which was as black as it could be at that time, 70% black, maybe 80% black. It was a perfect record for that time frame. It was coming on the heels of Gil Scott-Heron, which was another independent record from this region, and that was beginning to catch on. Mm-hmm. And so this record bridged us into a label. After we released this single, it did well enough for us to say, well, we should have an album. Because remember what I said, the reason we did an album back in Indico's time or anything, you have to have an album to have credibility in the marketplace. And so
now let me ask you real quick, putting that together, the art side of it that you were about to delve into, explain the feel of Blackfire, what you were looking for, and how you achieved that through art.
Well, you already know what I was trying to achieve, and that is this Africanness, this African basis for what black culture in this country was, I'm going to say, based on. And I wanted to bring out that history. I wanted people not to be afraid or ashamed of their African roots, both of which sentiments were relevant to that time frame or prevalent. So that was my own personal view. I happen to have a brother who played bass on African Rhythms and who is an artist. A quick story. My brother is a professional artist now. He purchases the art at VCU hospital system for the whole system. He has budget of $1 million to buy art as they put up new buildings. He's the sole person to do that. He's an artist because he tells the story. He's an artist because my mother would give him a nickel or a dime when he would draw things at his elementary school, and he thought, oh, I can always make money from art. He just grew up thinking that you get money when you do art. But Muzi drew this painting. This painting is about 3 feet by 4 feet, maybe. He drew this painting. I think this is supposed to be me. I think this is imitating the Juju painted face cover from the first Juju record. On our way up to DC to one of our studio sessions, we're going to turn in the tapes to Jimmy Gray to make this record, and we had to have art. He finished this painting in the truck, in the van going up the highway. That's the story of this record. And he, if you look around and see some of the other Blackfire covers, you will see that every one of them has some distinctive, bold, African-oriented art.
And here's another one right here.
Yeah, this is the Wayne Davis. My brother Muzi did this as well. This is a very large painting that Kevin is very familiar with. This is actually, it's multimedia, has mirror around this. This is, Jimmy chose this as a Wayne Davis cover. And working with artists like Malik Edwards, who did the EU cover, and Mary Greer, and my brother. Oh, here's the EU cover. This is a very iconic work Malik did. These are all very political people. These were not just random people that could draw. These were people who had definite politics. Malik used to be a Black Panther. Mary Greer hung out with Gil Scott as a protege. She's a poet. She has a new poetry album. It was not new. It was recorded back then. So Jimmy chose his personnel not just based on cuteness or money, but politics was a part of it as well. And so the art became a very important part of Blackfire's legacy and its imagery. This painting is a very large painting, or was, because it's gotten away from it. It's like 6 feet by 6 feet. It's a very bold painting. You'll see this is like a rainbow from some other planet down to Earth, and it's a red, black, and green rainbow, and it's two African figures. And Mary Greer put this spaceship on it because there's a song on it called, in fact, the album is called Space Jungle Love is the title of the album. So we wanted space and this loving image. That's us being very literal in our interpretation of the art. But we released these records. We decided our format, we decided that the Strata East formula of 85% to the artist wouldn't work. You couldn't make the company sustain itself on just 15% of the return. So we did artist contracts that were 50-50. And that became kind of an independent norm, but that's something that we created out of our experience. There were a number of other labels that we would call our brother or sister labels. A label called Tribe, a label called Strata, which is in Detroit, Strata, and then Strata East. Stanley Cowell was from Detroit, so he was copying Strata. A label called Black Jazz in L.A. had a kind of a controversial history, but they had people like Doug and Gene Carn. Again, all of these things, all of these people, and all of these records, and all of this music had a kind of a through line. This Afrocentricity, this blackness, this black culture at the center of it. So that's Blackfire, and that's how we came about.
So, what happened in 1980?
In 1980, Blackfire, Jimmy Gray, and Plunky had our Strata East moment. Blackfire was releasing other artists like Experience Unlimited, their first album, Lon Marshall, who was a member of my band, his offshoot album, and Plunky wanted to release more Plunky music. So I decided that I would create my own label. It would be called Name Brand Records. We released a record called Make a Change. Make a Change had a 4 on the floor dance song. It was called Everywhere But Loose. And it became a kind of a hit. Just like The Bottle was a hit, Everywhere But Loose became a hit record all by itself, not with Jimmy's and my promotion. A quirk in nature that a very famous DJ, Larry Levan, who was the principal DJ at a place called the Paradise Garage in New York, was playing Everywhere But Loose nightly, and it was a hot record. For some reason, the gay audience really was attracted to that song. I don't know why. Even in DC, there was a great following in the discotheques, the dance clubs for that song. And so that song was catching on fire. And so this is why I call it a Strata East moment, because that record would have required us to divert all of Blackfire's attention to promote and catch up with the hotness of that record. And we weren't prepared to do it. We didn't have the finances to do it. And so I made the decision to take the record. It was released on Blackfire, but I went to a subsidiary of Buddha Records, Sutra Records. They came to me to say, this record is hot in New York. You guys aren't surfacing it. Sounds like the Bottle thing again. We'd like to release it. If you give it to us, we can get it all that it deserves. We did. They had Larry Levan do a remix of it, and they did what they said they were going to do. It made it onto Billboard's disco charts in the top 80. In London, it went to a top 10 status. It was my biggest selling record. Because why? Because those are the people that control the mechanisms to get popular distribution and popular promotion. We couldn't have gotten a record on radio in New York. We didn't have the wherewithal. I don't know if you know this, but that kind of stuff is paid for. You have to have money to pay. It was called payola, but you have to pay, and we didn't have that kind of money. Our thing has been an underground, an independent route, and so we made that decision. We took the record off of Blackfire. This is the single that Sutra released of that song, Every Way But Loose. The, the album version was called, we released it as Make a Change. They released it with the same cover, but changed the title to Every Way But Loose, because that was the song that was the linchpin of their promotion. And this is the original. Dang, Kevin, you have everything. This is the original version, Make a Change, on Blackfire. The Suture version just changed here and called it Every Way But Loose. This particular piece of artwork was done by a cousin of mine, Denny Williams. And this picture, you might see a man named Asante and Muzi and Rosmel and this group. We took this picture at Sears.
Well, I think it's a good point to hit break number 2. How about that?
Thank you.
All right. So part 3 is the resurgence, the investment in Blackfire, which seems to have happened during the 90s.
Yes.
Specifically 1993, correct?
Yes. What happened was we went into Jimmy and Blackfire, and even me and my label called Name Brand Records. We had a downturn. There was not a lot of money in our system. We weren't selling a lot of records. But Jimmy made a deal to have the records distributed in Japan with a company called P-Vine Records. And they released or reissued some of those Blackfire titles. With that came new international distribution. And so those titles that we had begun making in 1975 found new homes internationally, mainly in Japan and in Europe. Also, there was another phenomenon going on in the 90s with hip-hop producers. And the hip-hop producers were doing what they call crate digging. They were going through finding obscure songs and obscure records that they could sample. And part of the aesthetics of that was to find samples that you only knew, or things that weren't widely known. So they wouldn't sample a Motown record or some hit record. They would look for records that were obscure and that had a beat or had a groove or something about them. And Blackfire records fit that category. If you listen to the Experience Unlimited album, it's black rock and roll. If you listen to African Rhythms, it's kind of funky soul music. And so those songs, those records were ripe for sampling. And lots of people sampled our music, but I'm going to talk about just briefly about a very notable one. In 1999 or therearound, I became aware that somebody had re-recorded my song African Rhythms with the opening monologue, the whole thing. And it was told to me this is Plunky, somebody has sampled your record without permission. And I said, oh great, I'm gonna get rich. But when I checked it out, it was this young man named J. Dilla on an album called Welcome to Detroit. And I talked to them. It turns out they hadn't sampled the record. They had re-recorded it. And if you don't know much about the business, you might not know that any song that's been published, that means put in public for sale, once it's put in sale, anybody can remake that song. There is a rate that you have to pay that is a minimum rate. It's set by law, and that rate is extremely low. Back then it was 7 cents a copy. So if you do the math, you could do 1,000 copies of a song, of a cover, and owe somebody $70. Which is why you always see, if you, even with Pat Boone re-recording Little Richard's records, because it's cheap. But sampling, where you use the actual sound of somebody's record, has been unregulated, and you can you could sue the person for everything that they made off it, or even penalize them more. So what they call an unauthorized sample can be very rewarding to the person who originally recorded it and very devastating to the person who cheats and takes that sample without getting permission. So that's what I had thought that Jay Dilla did, but no, he and his crew were smarter than that. They re-recorded the record to sound almost exactly like mine, enough to that if you heard it over the phone, you say, wow, that's Plunky's record. That's Plunky talking.
Well,
but
I think we should play it.
Go ahead, that's a good idea. You can play it as background. Ah, that's my rhythm. So Jay Dilla recorded it, and when I found out he still owed me what they call mechanical royalties, that 7 cents a copy. And I told my brother, I said, we're not gonna sue them for that. We're not gonna do anything. I said this almost verbatim. I said, well, Muzi, we're not gonna sue them and pursue them. One, they're just some young guys from Detroit. They probably don't have a lot of money, and it's probably not gonna amount to anything. Well, Jay Dilla died not that long after, but his beat making had become and has remained legendary. He changed the style of drumming for soul music and in hip hop. And this song, his version of the song, I'll give you the epilogue. His version of the song was sampled by a rapper named J. Cole, like in 2016 or 2017. And I'll say epilogue, I get 15% of the J. Cole version because I'm the original composer of Jay Dilla's version that was sampled, and I've made more money from that than the rest of my career. J. Cole's, I don't know how much money rappers make. I don't know how they do it. All I know is I get checks from that more than I got from the original African rhythms, you know. Now, Kevin has raised the issue of where it has gone from there, that you know now you're in a place, you're in this room, which in some ways is kind of iconic. It might even be considered sacred, because this represents the kind of place that has been responsible for the rebirth of something called vinyl as a medium for listening. But in between, say, 99, when Jay Dilla was doing his thing, till now, there was a period at which, well, just in the 90s, CDs came to being. And I'm going to be telling you things of how wrong I can be. When CDs came to being, we said, Jimmy and I said, you know, we have to digitize everything because people aren't going to be listening to vinyl anymore. We got to put everything on CD. And then instead of those big 2-inch tapes for masters, let's put everything on these little DAT tapes so it's digitized. Well, the digital tapes weren't worth a poot. They don't last worth for nothing, and they don't sound great after 10 years. Vinyl, however, still does. The other part of that is that there is a new wave of people like you all over the world, not just in DC people are buying vinyl, but in Europe, in South America, in Africa, in India, in China, and in Japan. People are loving the sound of vinyl. They love the textile nature of the fact that you can touch it. They love the bigness of the album covers because it's like art you can put on the walls. There's been a rebirth of vinyl, and in addition to that, a rebirth of the sound of the 70s and the 80s, because the recording techniques changed. Digital recording is different from analog recording. And apparently people hear a difference as well. The warmth of vinyl people are attracted to. So I say that to say there's been a company, there are several companies. I still work with P-Vine in Japan, but in 2001, I started working with a company called Strut Records out of London. And Strut, along with, there are companies who specialize in reissuing these older analog recordings, be it blues music or rock and roll music or jazz music or soul music. There are companies who specialize in resurrecting that kind of music. Strut is one of those companies. There's a company called Now Again, which is an offshoot of Stone's Throw. Thank you. There are companies, and then of the major companies, they have divisions that resurrect this kind of music. And so Black Fire which one might have thought had run its course by the end of 1980, but was resurrected in 1993. Black Fire has been resurrected again in the 2000s by this company Strut, who has been subsumed by another company called K7. Strut is now a subsidiary of a larger German company, which also features resurrecting music. So Strut has released, for example, divergent music like Patrice Russian's catalog they bought. They've released all of the new reissues of Sun Ra, come out of Strata East. Out of Strut. And I'm announcing today that we have consummated a deal to have Strut reissue and release all of the Blackfire catalog, which will make it available to you and people around the world in a way that Plunky couldn't have done on his own, because I still don't have the same kind of money that I didn't have back then. It takes somebody else to be able to put that music and produce these records at a sufficient enough quantity and distribution level to service the people. And so we're happy to have a new partnership with Strut Records. And at the same time, I'm continuing to release my own music through a company called Name Brand Records. Name Brand stands for New African Musical Enterprises. So I'm still basically doing Blackfire and Strata East work as I go forward.
Well, thank you for that, Plunky. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everybody here does.
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank again HR Records. We got a number of different people that were involved today. Thank you for everybody, Blackfire, everybody that was involved. All right, we're taking a quick break here.
Oh, okay. Let me say hello to Jamal. I've been talking about Blackfire and Jimmy Gray, and that's Jimmy Gray's son. And by reference, he's my adopted son, and he and I work together still on Blackfire, and I'm proud for that association and the continuation of that. Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Let me do a commercial, and that is to say we have these wonderful record bags with Blackfire logo on one side and the HR record store logo on the other side. We have some Blackfire t-shirts with our logo that was designed by Mary Greer way back in the day. The shirts were designed by Jamal. We have Blackfire merchandise on sale. It's kind of random, but everything from 45s to albums, some reissues, some original, some CDs, even some things that you might not know about called cassettes. They're analog, but they were originally mass produced back in the day. We used to sell cassettes back when albums were done. Some people didn't do albums, they did cassettes. And so this is just a sampling of the things that were all things Blackfire. So please partake, please buy and tell your friends.
All right, well, thanks again, Plunky. And, of course, thank you, DJ Underdog, killing it. Thank you.
Thank you, DJ Underdog. Sorry we couldn't get all your okay.
Well, thank you for the Dilla, though. I mean,
Yeah,
that was
good.
amazing.
Right on time. Huh? Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Great job.
Thank you, sir.
You know I talk, so all you have to do is guide.
Yeah, that's my job. I know you have every detail in your head. So my job is to make sure you just don't get